Orbital Station Harmony 7 floated in the darkness of neutral space, like a massive spinning wheel of metal and light. And inside its corridors walked beings from 100 different worlds, who had come to trade and work and live together in what the Galactic Council called peace. Part Jisoo was one of the humans who called this station home. And she had lived here for 3 years, working in the agricultural sector, where she grew earth plants for homesick humans and curious aliens, who wanted to taste vegetables from the famous Death World. She was not a tall woman, and she was not a loud woman. And most species on the station would describe her as soft and gentle and kind to everyone she met. And this was true because Jisoo believed that kindness cost nothing and meant everything. On this particular morning cycle, Jisoo woke up early in her small quarters and began preparing something special. And she moved around her tiny kitchen with careful hands as she chopped vegetables and measured ingredients that she had been saving for weeks. Today, she would make her grandmother's kimchi jjigae recipe. And this was not just any food, but a connection to her family back on Earth, who she had not seen in 3 long years. And as she cooked, she hummed an old Korean song that her grandmother used to sing. The smell filled their quarters and spilled out into the corridor. And passing aliens wrinkled their various nose equivalents at the powerful aroma that humans seemed to love so much. And Jisoo smiled because this smell meant home to her. She carefully packed the stew into a sealed container that would keep it warm, and she held it close to her chest as she walked through the station toward the communal mess hall, where workers from all species gathered to eat their meals. The mess hall was a massive circular room with tables designed for different body types. And Jisoo found her usual spot near the window where she could look out at the stars while she ate. And she set down her precious container with gentle hands. Across the room, a Valorian merchant named Crystal watched the human woman with his compound eyes that could see in 12 directions at once. And he clicked his mandibles together in what his species called anticipation. Crystal was an insectoid being with a hard shell, the color of dried blood, and legs that bent in ways that made humans uncomfortable. And he believed with all his hearts that Valorians were superior to what he called the soft species. He had heard rumors about human food, and other merchants had told him that the proteins found in Earth cuisine were rare and valuable in certain parts of the galaxy. And he had been waiting for an opportunity to acquire some without paying. Jisoo opened her container, and the smell of her grandmother's recipe filled the air around her table. And she closed her eyes for a moment to breathe it in and remember sitting in her grandmother's kitchen as a child. But then she realized she had forgotten to get utensils from the dispensing station. And she looked at her food and then at the station across the room. And she decided to leave her lunch for just a moment because surely no one would bother it. She stood up and walked away. And she did not see Crick still moving through the crowd on his 6 legs with speed that his species was known for. And she did not see him reach her table with his grasping claws extended. Crickstale grabbed the container and tucked it under his thorax. And he scurried away through the crowd before anyone could react. And by the time Jisoo returned with her utensils, he was already 3 corridors away. Jisoo stood at her empty table and looked at the spot where her grandmother's recipe had been. And her face changed in a way that made the aliens nearby feel something uncomfortable in their various chest cavities. She did not yell, and she did not scream, and she did not run to find security or demand justice from the station authorities. And instead, she simply sat down in her chair and stared at the empty table with eyes that held sadness deeper than space itself. A Mordax trader at the next table leaned toward his companion and whispered that someone had stolen the human's food. And his companion made a sound of disbelief because everyone knew you should not take things from humans. But Jisoo just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked so small and so sad that even species who did not understand human expressions could tell that something precious had been taken from her. She stayed for a few minutes, and then she stood up and walked out of the mess hall without eating anything. And the other humans in the room watched her go with expressions that the aliens could not quite read. One human turned to another and asked if that was Jisoo from the botanical section. And the other human nodded and said yes, and that someone had stolen her lunch. And then they both went quiet in a way that made nearby aliens nervous. Word began to spread through the station, the way information always spreads in closed communities. And by the end of the work cycle, every human on Harmony 7 knew what had happened to the kind woman from the agricultural sector. They knew that Jisoo helped everyone who asked, and some who did not ask. And they knew that she had shared her earth plants with homesick humans for free. And they knew that she never complained about anything, even when life on the station was hard. Security Chief Vaughn was a Krellian officer with gray skin and 4 arms. And he received no reports about the theft because no human filed a complaint. And this was strange, because humans usually loved their bureaucratic processes. He made a note in his personal log that something had happened in the mess hall, but no one was talking about it. And he had learned during his years on the station that human silence was more dangerous than human shouting. In her quarters that night, Jisoo sat on her bed and looked at a photograph of her grandmother who had passed away 2 years ago. And she had made that recipe to feel close to her again. And now that connection had been stolen by someone who did not understand what they had taken. She did not cry because she had learned long ago that tears did not bring back what was lost. And instead, she simply touched the photograph and whispered that she was sorry. And then she went to sleep with an empty stomach and an emptier heart. But while Jisoo slept, other humans were awake and talking in quiet voices in maintenance corridors and cargo bays and medical stations throughout Harmony 7. And they were asking questions and sharing information and making plans. Someone had hurt one of their own, and the kind ones were always protected by those who were not so kind. And by morning, the humans of Harmony 7 would know exactly who had taken Jisoo's lunch and exactly where to find him. Crickstall scurried through the lower corridors of Harmony 7 with the stolen container clutched against his thorax. And his compound eyes scanned every direction for anyone who might have followed him from the mess hall. He found an empty cargo bay in Section 14, where broken equipment waited for repair. And he squeezed himself between 2 damaged atmospheric processors and finally allowed himself to relax his grip on his prize. The container was still warm in his claws, and he could smell something powerful coming from inside. And he clicked his mandibles in anticipation as he prepared to open it and see what human food looked like. When he lifted the lid, the smell hit him like a physical force, and his antennae curled backward in response to the intensity of spices and fermented vegetables and something meaty that his species had no name for. He dipped one claw into the red liquid and brought it to his mouth parts. And immediately his entire digestive system rejected the taste. And he spat and clicked and made sounds of disgust that echoed through the empty cargo bay. This was not food. He thought to himself, this was poison wrapped in the smell of death. And he could not understand how humans could eat such things and survive. But then again, humans came from a death world where everything was trying to kill everything else. He decided he would not eat this terrible substance, but he could still sell it to collectors who wanted exotic items from Earth. And he knew a Mordax trader on level 8 who dealt in rare biological materials. While Crickstall made his plans in the cargo bay, the humans of Harmony 7 were gathering information through networks that no alien species fully understood. Sergeant Yoon Dae-ho was a retired military man who now worked in the maintenance department. And he had served in 3 conflicts before coming to the station to find peace. But peace did not mean he had forgotten his skills. He was a quiet man with gray in his hair and scars on his hands, and he smiled often, but his eyes never stopped watching. And when he heard about Jisoo, he put down his tools and started making calls. Dr. Kwan Mai worked in the medical station on level 12, and she was small and precise and knew every corridor on Harmony 7 because she had walked them all during emergency calls at every hour of the cycle. She knew Jisoo because Jisoo had brought her flowers from the botanical section when Mireille was having a difficult week. And when she heard what happened, she started checking the medical database for all Valorian residents on the station. Big O. Tassin was a cargo handler who stood 2 meters tall and could lift containers that most species needed machines to move. And despite his size, he was gentle and soft-spoken, and children of all species loved to climb on his shoulders. He had known Jisoo since she arrived on the station, and she had helped him learn to read better because he had struggled with education as a child. And when he heard someone had stolen from her, his gentle face became something else entirely. These three were not the only humans who cared about Jisoo. And throughout the station, other humans were asking questions in places where aliens never thought to listen. And information was flowing through human networks like water through pipes. By the second cycle after the theft, every human on Harmony 7 knew that a Valorian merchant named Crystal had been seen near Jisoo's table right before the food disappeared. And they knew which section he lived in and which routes he walked. Security Chief Vaughn noticed something strange during his patrol of the upper levels, and he stopped to watch a group of humans talking near an airlock. And when they saw him looking, they smiled and waved and went back to their conversation. He walked on, but something bothered him, and he had served on this station for 15 years, and he had learned to read the moods of different species. And humans were acting in a way he had seen before, but could not quite remember. Then it came to him, and he stopped walking so suddenly that a Kralith behind him almost crashed into his back. And he remembered his training at the Galactic Security Academy when a human instructor had given a lecture about his own species. When humans go quiet, something is about to happen, the instructor had said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. And when humans smile while being quiet, you should start preparing your incident reports in advance. Vaughn looked around the corridor and counted 3 humans within his sight. And they were all smiling, and they were all quiet. And he felt a chill run down his spine that his species was not supposed to be able to feel. He went to his office and pulled up the station logs. And he searched for any incidents involving humans in the past 2 cycles. And he found nothing except a minor note about a possible theft in the mess hall that no one had officially reported. He cross-referenced the note with the sector assignments and found that a human, female named Park Jisoo, worked in the botanical section. And he searched her file and found that she had no complaints and no violations and was described by supervisors as exemplary. Cricksdale emerged from the cargo bay when he was sure the corridors were empty, and he made his way to level 8 where the Mordax trader kept a shop that sold items of questionable origin. The Mordax was a large being with scales and 2 made teeth, and he looked at the container that Cricksdale placed on his counter with eyes that held no warmth. "Human food," Cricksdale said with clicking pride. "Genuine Earth recipe. Very rare. Very valuable to the right buyer." The Mordax pushed the container back across the counter without opening it, and he shook his massive head and made a sound that meant absolute refusal. "I do not deal in human goods," the Mordax said, "especially goods that were not freely given, and you should return that to whoever you took it from before you learn why my people do not steal from humans." Cricksdale was confused and angry, and he grabbed the container and left the shop while cursing the Mordax for being a coward. And he did not notice the human maintenance worker watching him from across the corridor. Daho noted the location and the time, and he sent a message to the network. And within minutes, every human on the station knew where Cricksdale was and where he was going. That night, Cricksdale returned to his quarters on level 6, and as he walked through the corridors, he began to notice something that made his antennae twitch with nervousness. There were humans everywhere he looked, and they were not doing anything wrong, and they were not approaching him or speaking to him, but they were watching with eyes that never blinked and smiles that never wavered. He walked faster, and the humans did not follow, but when he turned corners, there were more humans waiting, and they just watched him pass with those strange soft faces that his species had always found unsettling. He reached his quarters and locked the door behind him, and he checked the lock 17 times before he felt safe enough to breathe. And he told himself that humans were just soft, weak creatures who could not possibly mean him any harm. But sleep did not come easily to Crickstyle that night, and every sound in the corridor made his compound eyes snap open, and in the darkness of his quarters, he began to wonder if stealing that food had been a mistake. 3 cycles had passed since Crickstyle had taken the humans' food, and in that time, something had changed on Harmony 7 that he could feel but could not explain. And everywhere he went, the humans were watching. He tried to conduct his normal business in the trading halls, but the other merchants avoided his stall, and when he approached potential customers, they made excuses and walked away without looking back. A Jarelian trader who had done business with him for years refused to acknowledge his presence. And when Crickstyle demanded to know why, the Jarelian simply pointed to the humans standing near the entrance of the trading hall. "They have marked you for something," the Jarelian whispered, "and I will not be standing near you when whatever is coming arrives. And you should leave this station while you still have legs to carry you." Crickstyle clicked his mandibles in frustration and stormed out of the trading hall. And he decided that he would report these humans to station security because surely there were laws against harassment and intimidation. He marched to the security office on level 3 and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. And Security Chief Vaughn listened to his complaint with a face that revealed nothing of what he was thinking. "The humans are following me," Crickstyle said with indignation. "They watch me everywhere I go, and they are trying to destroy my business. And I demand that you arrest them for their criminal behavior." Vaughn pulled up the security feeds from the past 3 cycles and searched for any evidence of what Crickstyle was describing. And he found humans in the corridors and the trading halls and the common areas. But they were never close enough to constitute harassment. "I see humans going about their normal activities," Vaughn said carefully, "and none of them appear to be following you or interfering with your business. And without evidence of actual wrongdoing, I cannot take action against them." Crickstyle made sounds of outrage and demanded that Vaughn investigate further. And Vaughn agreed to increase patrols in Crickstyle's section. But something in the security chief's eyes suggested that he knew more than he was saying. When Crickstyle left the security office, Vaughn sat at his desk for a long time and stared at the screen that showed camera feeds from across the station. And he watched the humans moving through the corridors with purpose that was invisible to their targets. He'd been a security officer for 20 years, and he had seen many things in his career, and he knew that what was happening was beyond his ability to stop even if he wanted to. The humans were hunting, and Vaughn had learned long ago that humans did not hunt like other species, and they did not chase or attack or make their intentions known until it was far too late. He made a personal note in his encrypted file that he expected an incident within the next few cycles. And then he went home and tried not to think about what was coming. Crickstyle returned to his quarters and found that his door was slightly open, and his heart beat faster as he pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside with claws extended for combat. His quarters were empty and nothing appeared to be missing. But the container with the human food was sitting on his table in a different position than where he had left it, and someone had opened it and closed it again. He checked every corner of his small living space and found no one, and he checked the lock on his door and found that it was working perfectly, and he could not explain how someone had gotten inside. Fear began to crawl through his thorax like parasites, and he took the container and shoved it under his sleeping platform. And he told himself that he was imagining things because the door had been locked and no one could have entered. That night he heard sounds in the corridor outside his quarters, and he pressed his audio receptors against the door and heard footsteps that stopped right outside and then moved on. He waited for hours, but the sounds did not return, and eventually exhaustion forced him into an uneasy sleep that was filled with dreams of human faces watching him from the darkness. The next cycle began with an announcement that there would be maintenance work in Section 6, and Krixtio's lights flickered 3 times before stabilizing, and he told himself it was nothing unusual. He left his quarters to find food in the mess hall, and in the corridor, he passed a human male in a maintenance uniform who was working on a panel in the wall, and the human smiled at him and wished him a good cycle. Krixtol hurried past without responding, and he did not see the human watch him go with eyes that held no warmth despite the smile that remained fixed on his face. In the mess hall, Krixtol tried to eat, but his appetite had abandoned him, and he noticed that the humans in the room were not looking at him, and somehow that was worse than when they had been watching. He returned to his quarters earlier than usual and found that his door lock was not responding to his identification, and he pressed his claw against the scanner again and again, but the light stayed red. A human woman appeared at the end of the corridor, and she walked toward him with a toolkit in her hands, and she asked if he was having trouble with his door. "I can take a look at that for you," she said with a friendly expression. "These old locks fail sometimes, and maintenance has been meaning to replace them, so let me just check the wiring." Krixtol did not want this human touching his door, but he had no choice because he could not get inside, and he stepped back and watched as she opened the panel and examined the connections inside. She worked for several minutes and then announced that the problem was fixed, and she stepped aside with a smile and gestured for him to try his identification again. The lock opened on the first try, and Krixtol pushed inside and closed the door behind him without thanking the human, and he heard her footsteps recede down the corridor. But when he tried to lock his door from inside, the mechanism made a strange sound, and the indicator light stayed amber instead of turning green. And no matter how many times he pressed the lock command, the door would not secure. He tried for an hour to fix it himself, but Valorians were merchants and not engineers, and eventually he gave up and pushed his heavy sleeping platform against the door to create a barricade. That night the lights in his section failed completely, and emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow. And Krixtol sat in his quarters, surrounded by darkness, and listened to the sounds of footsteps in the corridor outside. They stopped outside his door, and he heard breathing that was slow and controlled. And then a voice whispered something in a human language that he did not understand. He pressed himself against the far wall and waited for the door to open. But after several minutes, the footsteps moved away, and when the main lights came back on, he was still shaking. In the maintenance office on level 4, Deho logged that he had completed repairs in Section 6, and he noted that all systems were functioning normally. And then he sent a message to the network that simply said, "Tonight," and nothing more. Security Chief Vaughn was eating his morning meal when the call came through on his communicator, and the voice on the other end belonged to a young Krellian officer who sounded like he was trying very hard not to be sick. "Chief, you need to come to Cargo Bay 7 immediately," the officer said. "We have a situation, and I do not know how to describe it, and I think you should see it for yourself." Vaughn put down his food and grabbed his equipment belt, and he walked through the corridors toward the cargo section with a heaviness in his chest, because he already knew what he would find. The smell reached him before he reached the cargo bay, and it was the smell of Valorian blood, which had a chemical quality that most species found unpleasant. And 2 of his officers were standing outside the entrance with faces that had lost all color. "What do we have?" Vaughn asked, and his officers could not answer with words, and they simply stepped aside and let him enter the cargo bay to see for himself. Krixtol was there, or what remained of him, and the pieces were arranged in a pattern that was too precise to be random, and Vaughn stood in the doorway for a long moment before he could make himself walk forward. The Valorian had been taken apart with surgical precision, and each section of his body had been placed in a specific location on the cargo bay floor. And there was something almost artistic about the arrangement that made it worse. Vaughn had seen death many times in his career, but he had never seen death that looked like this. And he knelt beside what had been Kriegstall's head and tried to understand what had happened. There were no signs of struggle anywhere in the cargo bay, and the floor showed no evidence of a chase or a fight. And Kriegstall had been killed somewhere else and brought here to be displayed. Vaughn stood up and looked around the cargo bay for any evidence that might tell him who had done this, and he found nothing except the body and the smell and the careful arrangement of pieces. He checked the security cameras in the section and found that every single one had malfunctioned during the night cycle, and the logs showed a maintenance error that had caused the system to shut down for approximately 4 hours. He pulled up the maintenance schedule and found that a human named Yoon Daeho had been assigned to Section 7 that night, and he sent officers to bring Daeho in for questioning. Daeho arrived at the security office with a calm expression and a cup of tea in his hands, and he sat down across from Vaughn and waited for the questions to begin. "Where were you last night during the third shift?" Vaughn asked, and Daeho smiled and said he had been in the recreation center playing cards with 3 other humans until the early morning. Vaughn checked the recreation center logs and found that Daeho had signed in at the beginning of third shift and signed out 4 hours later, and 3 other humans confirmed that he had been there the entire time. He brought in Dr. Kwan Mai-Ray, and she explained that she had been in the medical station treating a Jarelian with digestive problems. And the medical logs confirmed her story, and the Jarelian confirmed that she had never left his side. Big O Tayson had been in the cargo section that night, but he had been in Cargo Bay 12, which was on the opposite side of the station from Cargo Bay 7. And the surveillance footage showed him loading containers for 6 hours without a break. Every human that Vaughn questioned had an alibi, and every alibi was confirmed by logs and witnesses and evidence that could not be disputed. And after 12 hours of interviews, Vaughn had nothing. He brought in Park Jisoo because her name kept appearing in connection with the other humans. And she sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes filled with something that looked like genuine distress. "I heard what happened," Jisoo said quietly, "and I am very sorry because I never wanted anyone to be hurt. And I wish this had not happened because violence does not bring back what was taken." Vaughn watched her face for any sign of deception and found nothing except sadness and a tiredness that seemed to go deeper than lack of sleep. And he believed that she was telling the truth. "Someone returned something to you," Vaughn said carefully. "I noticed that you had your food container back in the mess hall yesterday, and I wonder if you could tell me how that happened." Jisoo looked down at her hands and was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had found the container outside her door that morning, and she did not know who had put it there. Vaughn waited for her to say more, but she remained silent, and he could see that she was not going to volunteer any information, and he knew that pressing her further would accomplish nothing. "You may go," he said finally, and Jisoo stood and walked to the door, and she paused and turned back with an expression that Vaughn would remember for years afterward. "Chief Vaughn," she said, "I want you to know that I did not ask anyone to do anything. And what happened to Kriegstall was not justice, but something else. And I will have to live with knowing that someone was hurt because of me." She left the security office, and Vaughn sat at his desk and stared at the wall. And he understood that he would never solve this case because there was nothing to solve. The station administrators reviewed his report and declared the death an unsolved incident with no suspects and no evidence. And Kriegstall's remains were sent back to his family on the Valorian homeworld. Vaughn filed his official report with all the appropriate language about unknown perpetrators and ongoing investigation. And then he opened a separate file that was encrypted and accessible only to him. In this private file, he wrote what he actually believed. And he described how a community of humans had coordinated to punish someone who had hurt one of their own. And he detailed how they had done it without leaving any evidence. He noted that humans were the only species on the station who had the combination of intelligence and physical capability and social coordination to accomplish something like this. And he noted that they had protected each other flawlessly. His conclusion was simple. Human social bonds should not be underestimated. And humans will protect their own with methods that other species cannot anticipate. And the kindest among them are often protected by those who are not kind at all. He saved the file and locked it with his personal encryption, and then he went home and tried to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cargo bay and the pieces arranged in that careful pattern. The station returned to normal operations within a few days, and the humans went back to their jobs and their routines. And no one spoke about what had happened because there was nothing to say. Justice had been served in the way that humans understood justice. And Krikstal had learned too late that some things should not be taken from people who are loved by dangerous friends. 2 months had passed since the incident in Cargo Bay 7, and orbital station Harmony 7 had returned to its normal rhythms of trade and work, and the complicated dance of species living together in space. The official records showed an unsolved death with no suspects and no leads, and the administrators had closed the case and moved on to other concerns, and the paperwork had been filed and forgotten. But the unofficial records were different, and every species on the station had heard the whispers about what had happened to the Valorian who stole from a human. And those whispers had changed the way aliens looked at their human neighbors. Security Chief Vaughn had sent his private report to the Galactic Council through encrypted channels. And the Council had added it to a file that contained similar reports from stations and colonies and ships across the galaxy. The file was labeled Human Social Behavior, Threat Assessment, and it was classified at the highest level. And it contained hundreds of incidents where humans had demonstrated their capacity for coordinated and untraceable violence. Vaughn did not know if the Council would ever act on the information in that file, and he suspected they would not because humans were too valuable as workers and soldiers and traitors to antagonize. On Harmony 7, life continued as it always had. And Park Jisoo returned to her work in the botanical section, where she grew earth plants and shared them with anyone who asked, and she smiled at everyone she met. But there was something different about the way other species treated her now, and they were more polite and more careful. And when she walked through the corridors, they stepped aside to let her pass. She did not like this new attention, and she did not want to be feared, and she had tried to tell her friends that she had not asked for what happened, but they had simply smiled and told her not to worry. Daeho had patted her shoulder and said that she should not feel guilty because bad things happen to bad people. And Mireille had hugged her and said that family protects family. And Tayson had made her tea and told her to rest. She had accepted their kindness because she knew they meant well. But late at night, she sometimes thought about Krikstal and wondered if what happened to him was truly justice or something darker. A new merchant arrived on the station during the 3rd week of the new quarter, and he was a young Valorian with bright shell coloring and the confident manner of someone who had never experienced consequences. His name was Rixenol, and he was Krikstal's nephew who had come to collect his uncle's business inventory. And he walked through the station like he owned it, because his family was wealthy and powerful on the Valorian homeworld. He had heard rumors about what had happened to his uncle, but he did not believe them. And he thought that humans were soft, weak creatures who could not possibly harm a Valorian. And he intended to prove this by showing no fear. On his 3rd day on the station, Rixenol was walking through the corridor near the mess hall when he bumped into a small human woman who was carrying a cup of tea. The tea spilled across the floor and splashed onto the human's clothes, and she made a sound of surprise and looked down at the spreading stain on her uniform with an expression of dismay. Rixinal opened his mandibles to say something dismissive, but before he could speak, he noticed that 5 humans had appeared around him in a semicircle, and they were all smiling with their strange flat teeth. The humans did not say anything, and they did not move closer, but their presence was suddenly overwhelming, and Rixinal felt his legs go weak beneath him in a way that his species called ancestral fear. One of the humans was enormous, bigger than any human Rixinal had ever seen, and he stepped forward and knelt beside the small woman and helped her clean the tea from her clothes with gentle hands. The huge human looked up at Rixinal with eyes that were calm and patient, and he spoke in a voice that was soft and pleasant, and he said words that Rixinal would remember for the rest of his life. "You should apologize to the lady," the human said, and there was no threat in his tone and no anger in his expression. But Rixinal understood with perfect clarity that this was not a suggestion. "I'm sorry," Rixinal said immediately, and his voice came out higher than he intended. "I was not watching where I was going, and I apologize for spilling your tea and ruining your clothes." The small woman looked at him with kind eyes and told him it was all right and that accidents happened, and she smiled at him in a way that seemed genuine, and Rixinal felt confusion mixing with his fear. "Let me buy you new tea," Rixinal said, and the words came tumbling out before he could stop them. "Let me buy everyone tea. Please, I insist. It is the least I can do." The humans exchanged glances that Rixinal could not read, and then the huge one nodded and stood up to his full height, and he clapped Rixinal on the shoulder with a hand that could have crushed his exoskeleton. "That is very kind of you," the huge human said. "Jishu loves the green tea from the dispensary on level 5, and we would be happy to join you for a cup." They walked together to the dispensary, and Rixinal ordered tea for everyone with hands that trembled slightly, and the humans chatted among themselves as if nothing unusual had happened. Across the mess hall, Security Chief Vaughn watched the scene unfold with an expression that was carefully neutral, and he made a mental note to add this incident to his private file. The humans had not threatened the young Valorian, and they had not touched him except for that single hand on his shoulder. But they had communicated something that words could not express, and the young Valorian had understood. Vaughn picked up his communicator and recorded a brief message. Recommendation: do not harm the kind ones, and do not take from those who are loved, because humans protect their own in ways that leave no evidence and no survivors. He added the recording to the encrypted file and then closed it, and he finished his meal and went back to his patrol with the weight of knowledge that he could never share officially. Jishu accepted the tea from Rixinal and thanked him sincerely, and she asked about his journey to the station and whether he needed help finding anything, and she was kind to him the way she was kind to everyone. The young Valorian left the station the next day with his uncle's inventory and a new understanding of humans that his people had failed to teach him, and he would tell others what he had learned. Humans were not soft and they were not weak, and they protected their own with a ferocity that left no traces. And the kindest among them were the most dangerous to harm because they were loved by those who had no kindness in their hearts. On Harmony 7, life continued as it always had, and Park Jisoo grew her plants and shared them freely, and she smiled at everyone she met. And the station turned slowly in the darkness of space where all debts were eventually paid. The humans watched over their own, and the aliens watched the humans. And somewhere in the Galactic Council archives, another report was added to a file that grew thicker with every passing year. And everyone who read it understood the same simple truth. Do not steal from humans, and especially do not steal from the kind ones. Because kindness is not weakness, and gentleness is not surrender. And those who mistake compassion for vulnerability learn their error only once.